Working all right? Okay, great. The title of this talk is Dynastic Thinking, and this is something I've been thinking about for a little bit. So it's sort of a work in progress, and I'm going to be sharing with you sort of some overcooked thoughts, some half-baked thoughts. Basically, the idea is that I would like to think about this subject with you and not just simply project ideas at you. Because I think that we're all kind of at a loss when it comes to thinking in this way. Thinking in terms of generations instead of just our own lives. I think most of us are victims of a kind of acculturation process that's intended to isolate us and kind of get us thinking in just the terms that are most conducive to helping companies make a lot of money or getting people to do things that the government wants them to do, rather than think in the terms that I'm going to be talking about here. So I want to start with the most successful household in the history of the world, and that's Abraham's household. This is when he was still referred to as Abram, and this is from Genesis chapter 12. And there's a lot of wordplay in Scripture. The problem is that it's in another language, and you don't get the wordplay. And there's sort of like tongue-in-cheek stuff and kind of jokes and stuff like that. And one of the jokes is the name of this guy, Abram, which means exalted father, a man with no kids. Okay, so this is how it starts, right? So, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country to the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. What's interesting to me about all of this is just how much that the promises that are given to Abram, he's not going to experience the blessings personally, directly himself. There are nations that will be blessed through him. There'll be descendants that will be blessed because of what he's done. But in terms of his own life, this is a dude who lives in a tent for the rest of his life in faith. And it'd be sort of like, I had this described to me this way one time when I was living on Cape Cod. I was a pastor on the Cape. Before that, I was a pastor in the inner city of Boston. Sometimes you get the inner city of Boston, sometimes you get Cape Cod. But anyways, Cape's a great place to live, but there was this guy who said, this whole episode with Abram would be like some guy from Puerto Rico arriving on the beach and just getting out of a little sort of dinghy and saying, "It's all mine. It's all mine. You don't know that, but it's all mine." God spoke to me and promised me this entire place. And then spent the rest of his life living in his little dinghy, It's kind of what you have with Abram. Now, there's a side to this that, of course, isn't like what I just kind of tongue-in-cheek described, but I'll get to it in a minute. So when we think about dynasties, when we think about, say, wealthy families that have productive property and pass it down from generation to generation, I think a lot of us, because we look at this through the lens of, say, film, associate this sort of thing with the trust fund kid, right? And there's always the trust fund kid in the films that we watch, particularly films that are like made for like teenagers. And the guy is just absolutely contemptible, right? The trust fund kid is always the kid that you just love to hate. And of course, the films are told in such a way that by the time the film is over, you know this kid's going to get it. It's like he's going to have something horrible happen to him, and we're all going to be really happy about that because he has everything, right? And he's just full of himself and contemptuous of it, when it comes to everybody else. So there's kind of a schadenfreude kind of thing that happens. You're like delighting in the pain of other people when you see this happen. But the guy who green-lighted that film was probably that guy. In other words, these guys know how to play the game, and they know how to use some of our feelings against us. And I think some of the kind of the I guess mixed feelings we have with regard to the subject of success has to do with this. We don't want to become that guy that we just love to hate. Now, a lot of you, I know, don't have the blessing of a public education, and I'm really happy for you. But I had a public education, and high school is just pretty much the way it's described, in film, particularly at cafeteria. There's always the cool table, right? And everybody who wants to be at the cool table. Then you get to the cool table, and you hate everybody else at the cool table. It's kind of really the way it is. And you kind of have to, sort of ask yourself, do I really want to go there? Do I want to be a success? Do I want to establish like a household that passes down wealth over the generations if it's going to result in this kind of thing? There's just this awful and kind of contemptible way of thinking and looking at the world. Well, I want to challenge that if that's something that maybe is holding you back from thinking in these terms. I really do want to promote dynastic thinking because I think it's what we need. What we want are great houses, not just households with productive property, but I think we also want extremely successful ones that develop into great houses in the old sense of that term. Now, I talk a lot about productive property and the importance of productive property. Productive property is property that gives you a living, provides you with a livelihood, and doesn't have to be liquidated in order to do that. When you talk to a lot of folks about property, they think about, toothbrushes and cars and stuff like that. But productive property is not like that. In order for any of that stuff to provide you with a living, you have to liquidate it. You have to sell it, and then it's gone. But when we talk about productive property, we're talking about something that, if you steward it well, it can continue to give you the blessings of a living. Obvious examples would be a family farm, right? Family farm is something you work, and because you work it, it produces, goods, produce that can be sold, and you can live on the income from that produce when things go well. Same thing with, say, rentals, real estate investments and so forth. Small businesses that can potentially become large businesses. What I'd like to propose to you is that sometimes people who acquire productive property become phenomenally successful, really, really wealthy. And sometimes they didn't even anticipate it happening. And I've known folks like this and like to reflect on you with this. Because really, there's no such thing as not having a money problem. Everybody's got a money problem. You can have, now most of us are familiar with the not enough money problem. That's an easy one to relate to. Yeah, I understand that problem. But there is a too much money problem. And I think what I just described when I, mentioned the prep school kid that you just kind of instinctively hate is the too much money problem. How do you handle the kind of success that it would be great to have without that success ruining you and making you the object of everybody else's animus? So that's what I'd like to think about with you a little bit. So you might say, you might be like Tevier in The Fiddler on the Roof. Remember Fiddler on the Roof, where his daughters take it upon themselves to find their love interests, and the second daughter falls in love with a commie. I don't know if you remember that in the film, but it's just like, I would have just said, no, I don't care. I don't care if you love them. No, no commies in my household. But anyway, there's this dialogue between the commie and Tevier, and the commie says, the wealth is the world's curse. And Tevier says, may the Lord curse me with this curse, and may I never recover. I think that's the kind of way we kind of feel with regard to this, but it is a challenge. It's a formidable task to know what to do with the great windfall, great success. How do we pass it along in a way that doesn't ruin the people that we want to bless? And that's something I'd like to, as I noted, just kind of think about with you. First of all, I'd like for you to consider that this is natural. Nepotism is natural. It's the way things were intended to work. And we see that right here in the story of Abram, right? There is a sense in which, right from the start, Abram's descendants are in view. And we ought to think about our own lives in that way too, that we think about ourselves with not just my own life as it's sort of envisioned to stretch before me that I'll, transverse over the course of the years, but that there are certain things that will continue. And what continues is worth thinking about. So I've had the experience of interacting with people who have belonged to families with legacies that go back many generations. So the book Man of the House, there's kind of an interesting story behind that book. Originally, it was commissioned to be written by a guy named John Zmirak. I don't know if anybody knows that name. But John is sort of like Pope Benedict meets Don Rickles. I don't know if you've ever remember Don Rickles, but Zmirak has a way of just like alienating everybody over time, but in a very amusing way. And so he was at Herder and Herder, which is the oldest family-held publishing house in the world. Goes back 7 generations. And so they had brought him in because there was this new trad Catholic kind of phenomenon going on. They wanted to sort of take advantage of that market. And so Zmirak is about as, I guess, trad, Catholic as you could come, as they could want. But over time, he alienated the woman who was the head of the American division of Herder and Herder, and that's Gwendolyn Herder, and he ended up getting fired. And when that occurred, my book went from being something that they were really going to promote to something that had leprosy. And they brought in another guy to become, John's replacement, and it was a guy from Berkeley, and he was a liberal guy, and he wanted me to completely rewrite the book. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And anyway, so one thing led to another, and it's not been published by Herder and Herder of Germany. But I got to know Gwendolyn Herder a little bit and kind of get an understanding and appreciation for how things work in a family that has productive property that is passed down over 7 generations. Think about that. She could look and see the portrait of her. That would be her 5th great-grandfather who founded the company. So anyway, and I've had other families that I've known, perhaps a family that you're familiar with, the Wilsons in Moscow. So I've gotten to know them a little bit over the years. And they really think of themselves as a family concern. That's probably pretty evident, just the way they conduct business and how they organize things and so forth. So since I've got a chance to see the Herders, and I've seen the Wilsons, and I've seen several other really great houses that have been able to pass down not only a legacy, but productive property over generations, I've been intrigued by the idea. Intrigued because I think that this holds great promise for us if we can recapture this way of thinking for re-Christianizing our country. Now, getting back to my point about this being God's idea, let's think a little bit about Abram, who eventually has his name turned into Abraham by the Lord because he's the father of many nations. His house was a great house. Even when he was alive, he could muster 318 fighting men from his house alone. So in other words, he wasn't a Puerto Rican living on the beach in a dinghy. He was a big thing. When Abram came to town, when his sort of caravan was passing through, people noticed this guy is wealthy. This guy has resources. This guy has men at his command. And if anybody should be able to think in these terms, it should be the Reformed who say they believe in covenant theology. But I've discovered, to my chagrin, that this is not so. And the reason is because in most NAPARC churches, and I know I'm in an Anglican church, and I want you to know I was baptized an Episcopalian in Buffalo, New York, at a very smells and bells, Anglican church. But the world that I'm part of, because I'm not in the CREC, I'm in the PCA. In other words, I'm in the same denomination as Tim Keller was. What I've discovered is we have so abstracted our theology that it exists just in our heads. And we don't have any real sense of just what covenant theology means as a way of life. It's just amazing to me. Like when I talk to some people in my denomination and I say covenant theology, they think in these categories, and I say it implies that you should have kids. And they're like, I'm not into that works righteousness thing. It's like, no, this is like just doing what the Bible says, and like passing on to the next generation the riches of our faith. And anyway, but you know what I'm getting at. So households can be very powerful, and I do think that they can be powerful in a good way or in a bad way. Now, when we think about a bad way, Soros. He's got a very powerful household, and he's determined to make sure you don't ever have one. It's the way he kind of operates. He's just a very creepy, weird, evil person. So, it's kind of like Dune. By the way, Dune is all about great houses, right? I don't know if you're a science fiction fan, if you're into Frank Herbert and the film Dune and that kind of stuff. Read the book, by the way, the book. But it's a way of thinking about how to order a world in the distant future that resembles the medieval world more than the world that we live in today. And I do believe that's where we're trending. I think we're heading into a kind of new feudalism. And we can build a feudal world that looks more like, Christendom, or something that might be cooked up by Silicon Valley, which would be really awful. Now, the way to think about this is when we think about great houses, they can affect great change over generations, but they can also shelter lesser houses. I know this might be a hard thing to kind of reconcile yourself to, but it's the way things tended to be ordered in the past. So I'm Scots-Irish. I'm half Scots-Irish. The other part is Swiss-German. So that's my family history from the old country. And I actually know my family history going all the way back to Jamestown. I've got a lot of interesting characters in my family history. But the thing that you saw, say, in Scotland, when you think of the clans, and this is something folks don't, I think, have an awareness of, but the great houses, the clans, would have lesser houses who had sworn loyalty to them, the septs. The Wileys were a sept of Gun, which means that you had an arrangement in which there had been a kind of covenant, and very much in the spirit of the old way of doing covenants, blood covenants, where the bonds were so strong that it was kind of life and death stuff, right? I think that something we need to think about. So when it comes to the way feudal societies were ordered, they were ordered by faith. There was a kind of fidelity that existed that bound people together. People were loyal to each other, and those loyalties were intergenerational. They were passed down over time. So if you were a sept of gun, your children are also, part of that arrangement. And so, as I noted, it gets passed down. Now, the world that we've created today is ordered not along the lines of great houses, but by publicly held corporations. So now some of those corporations are privately held, and for the sake of how we're going to go about doing things, I think we'd have to still employ the corporations to make things work legally, but they can be held by families, and I think we see examples of that. There already are families that work this way. The Mars family, Mars, M&Ms, a family that still has a controlling interest in the company that an ancestor founded. Think about the Waltons, like Walmart works that way too. So what I'm describing isn't all that alien. In fact, what I learned over the years, we've talked a little bit about the way rich people think and the way everybody else thinks. Rich people think this way. They really do. They think about owning stuff, passing stuff down through the generations. They're happy to employ you, but they won't bring you into the family. There's a pretty strong distinction there between the family and the corporation. And this actually is a good thing, because in publicly held companies, I think that there's a much more of a kind of Borg-like. If I'm going to kind of stay in the realm of science fiction, in Star Trek: The Next Generation, there's this thing called the Borg, and it's basically this thing that assimilates people. You will be assimilated, right? You will lose your identity. You will lose your individuality, and you'll be made part of this machine. And that's often the way public corporations work. Until they're not interested in employing you anymore, then they just kind of set you adrift and let you go. I remember back when I was a kid, everybody wanted to work for a major corporation because they were looking for what? A safe, secure job with benefits. And then my father-in-law, who had worked for Hamilton Standard for about 30 years and was a really, I think, accomplished engineer. He was the guy that invented the filament that goes into the big wind turbines that we all see, like in polluting our skylines. Anyways, if you look it up, you'll see his name is Dave Blaney. You know what he got for that? A plaque. He didn't get even extra shares of stock. Thanks, Dave. And then he got downsized. He was out of a job. And then they hired him back without the benefits and for less money as a consultant. Isn't that great? That's the way publicly held corporations can work. Now, that doesn't mean that great houses will treat you better, but at least in a situation like that, it's pretty clear who owns things and where you stand. And I think what we ought to think about is recovering a world that's ordered around households, and not just simply looking at households or treating households as a kind of speed bump or a kind of annoyance or something that we should take apart, because that's really the way things work in our world today. They try to take them apart, unless you're in that strata of society that I described a minute ago. Now, a lot of us, I know, go to the bad seed problem immediately when we think about this. How do we pass along a legacy and wealth in a way to make sure we don't end up with handing everything over to our Rehoboam? Remember Rehoboam, right? Rehoboam was David's grandson, Solomon's son. And then Jeroboam, led the northern tribes in a revolt because of some really stupid stuff that Rehoboam did. And when we think about stories like that, the term or the phrase shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations comes to mind. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But, somebody makes the money, Someone manages the money, and then someone loses the money in 3 generations. You end up with that. So how do we deal with that? Well, I think on one hand, we just have to accept there's only one household that's eternal. So every household will have an expiration date. But that's okay. Countries have expiration dates. Corporations have expiration dates. I can think of the names of corporations that seem like they would be around forever that no longer exist, and you've never heard of them because they don't exist. They're gone. So there's only one household that's eternal, and that's the Lord's house, right? And we belong to it because of adoption. We find ourselves in Christ. We're united to the only heir, and because of that, being united to the heir, we're joint heirs. So I think that's one thing to note, but I think that there's some other things that we should note that I would describe as non-solutions to the bad seed problem. One non-solution is just don't have kids. A lot of folks are availing themselves of that option today. I'm just not going to be, let myself be disappointed. I'm just not going to have kids. Is don't leave anything to your kids. It's kind of the Bill Gates philosophy. I didn't have anything, so you're not going to have anything. Like in the top 10 wealthiest people in the world, and you get, nothing. Well, I do believe he's going to leave each $1 million. That's not too bad, but when you, I don't know how many billions the guy has. When you don't trust your kids enough to hand on the family concern, let alone the wealth, what does that say about you? What does that say about Bill Gates? I don't think it says much that we can say is favorable. Another thing you can do that is a totally stupid thing to do is establish a charitable foundation. And I don't care how many rules or things you say, the money can and can't be used for. Philanthropists, professional philanthropists, are slime balls. I've known a few. And they just work their way, they're like weasels. They just kind of get in, they're like roaches. They just kind of get into everything. And when they get into things, after somebody is long gone, they start monkeying with the rules. Happens all the time. Pew Charitable Trust, perfect example. Harold J. Pew, Sun Oil, marvelous Christian man, very conservative in terms of his outlook socially. They fund like half the stuff on National Public Radio now. And I have been in their offices. I was involved in a grant process with them, and it's totally woke on the inside, just totally woke. It was like in the mid-'90s that it was that way. So that's a really dumb thing to do, because philanthropies are like a honeypot, and they just draw all kinds of kind of crazy people to them. So we need to be able to establish great houses and pass them down over the generations. So how do we do that? Well, I think one of the things to think about is why it would be necessary to do it in the first place. And the reason is the open society, Karl Popper and all those people who dreamed of this world where we would have no borders and everybody would just kind of like pursue their own private interests, and those interests got more and more petty over time. It's failing. The open society is failing. It's failing everywhere. It's been this past 5 years have been an apocalypse. Apocalypse meaning a revelation, an unveiling. We're actually seeing the rot. The reason why nobody trusts NIH anymore, the reason why nobody trusts anybody who is an expert anymore, is because the experts have been so fabulously wrong in so many places, so consistently. And you're like, and you want me to believe you again? I went along with you 5 years ago for a little bit, and then it was pretty evident that you didn't know what you were talking about, and now you want me to just sort of sign on again? And so everywhere, is a crisis of confidence. And the only people who are still confident when it comes to these institutions are the people who work in them. But I even think that they're kind of hedging their bets. So, problems that we've been talking about, inflation, shortages, the gray wave, the fact that there's this demographic winter that we're entering, and the deep down sense that many of us have that the elites don't like us anyway. and they just wish we were gone. I think all of that has created the conditions that call for something to come into existence or be recovered that can replace the things that we look to these institutions to provide for us. Trouble is that over the last, say, 150 years, we've gone from founding human nurturing institutions to human eliminating ones. And I think it's only when we recover a vibrant and intergenerational understanding of households that we will care enough about establishing human nurturing institutions that will be willing to pay the cost, because it's going to be costly. Lots of sacrifice, lots of long-term thinking, lots of putting other people ahead of yourself. That's going to be required. I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the best way to think about the Benedict option. Now, I know Rod Dreher, so Rod and I go back a few years, and I think he's been misunderstood, but I'm not really all that interested in getting you to agree with me about that. But what I want to do is get you thinking about building a tomorrow and not retreating necessarily from the world we find ourselves in. So there are a couple of places where I think that efforts have been underway for a little while that I'd like you to consider. I'd like to reflect a little bit on those with you. One is, of course, what we see going on in Moscow, in Idaho, with the efforts of Christ Church there. And what has been accomplished is really phenomenal in the sense that it's been so bootstrapped. They're always short of money. I don't know if you knew that, but they've managed to do a number of really phenomenal things on a shoestring. And, when we think about education or the arts or publishing or those sorts of things, those things are really valuable when it comes to supporting and strengthening households and getting people to think about the Christian faith in the way that I think we should be thinking about it. Now, like any set of institutions that has its shortcomings, it's maybe made some mistakes here and there, we should expect that. That's life, right? But I think, by and large, the legacy is a good one. And I've had a chance to see things up close. And I actually got to know Doug's father, Jim Wilson, a little bit. And he's the guy that the whole family kind of credits with their way of thinking about things. So he passed on to them a very sort of capacious and sort of inspiring vision of the future and what they could accomplish there in Moscow. And by the way, people are noticing. I don't know if you saw that interview with Ross Douthat. Doug was interviewed by the New York Times and their podcast. But before that, he had been interviewed by Wall Street Journal, and before that, you just kind of, you're like, all these people are noticing. But there was, the way Doug described it to me, 30 years of crawling over broken glass to get there. It's just a lot of pain that they've had to endure to find themselves at that spot. What we're doing in Battleground is a bit different. There's kind of a non-compete agreement that we have with them. It's nonverbal. But our focus is pretty different. We focus on unsexy businesses that are highly profitable. That's kind of the Battleground model. And homeschooling. We've decided we will never have a classical school. It's not because we're like on the warpath against classical education, but because we want to build our model on households even at that level of basic education. So homeschooling characterizes our approach. And over the last 5 years, it's just been crazy to see. We've kind of bought up, I think, about 10% of the town. Kind of nuts. And there's a huge, a light industrial park that's about 70 acres that's being developed right now for new businesses. A lot of it's being driven, of course, by Maddox Industrial Transformer and the family that owns it. It's a family-owned business that does, $500 million worth of business every year. It's huge. And they've got so much money They're literally buying up the town. Like the town actually calls us and says, hey, we got a building, you want to buy it? And it gets bought. So literally the town is getting, like when we talk about owned space, it's like 10% of the town is owned now by people connected to our church. And we're not the only game in town. I was talking with some guys at lunch about one of our close allies in the town. It's a Pentecostal church that believes in dominion theology. So it's a good-sized one. It's about 1,500 members. And when they think about dominion theology, they think more along the lines of praying spirits out of things and stuff like that. But they're still kind of on the same page with the idea of owned space. And we've got a very close relationship with them, as I mentioned. And basically, we've got a very strong voice in local politics. We have on the city council, I think 3 or 4 of the positions are people from our churches. And I think the city council is like 7 or 8. So we've got a pretty strong voice in things. And by the way, maybe I shouldn't mention this, the liberals down in Portland are starting to notice. Anyway, but good things are happening. When you irritate people in Portland, you know you're doing something right. So that, I think, but what's occurred took a lot of thought, took a lot of talent, took a lot of personal investment, risk-taking. Risk-taking is huge. You can't do this kind of stuff without taking significant risk. Thinking back to Abram, he took a big risk. He was already established in a household. He left his father's household, went to the place that he was told to go, started from scratch. That's the way it went. Now, he obviously took resources with him. I don't mean to oversell it. But I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to need if we're going to see great houses established, and a willingness to set out, to risk. And it's not going to work out every time. There's going to be not only great houses, but great failures along the way. This is something I think that would be worth thinking about. You familiar with a guy named Nassim Nicholas Taleb? He's an interesting character. He was a hedge fund manager in the Wall Street world, and he actually comes from the Levant. He's a Lebanese guy, so he deeply dislikes Muslims. So, but he's proposed a way of thinking about failure that I'd like us to consider, and what he thinks is we should be really grateful, so grateful for those who've attempted and failed, that we reward them in some way for at least trying, not playing it safe, getting out there and doing stuff. So I want to sort of end this experimental talk with some thoughts on establishing a great house and making it work over generations. And I speak as a person who's, as I noted in my last talk, building the wagon while I ride it. I don't have it all figured out. But I think there is the beginning of, in the beginning, there's got to be a vision. There's got to be a vision. You don't win a marathon by accident. You don't just kind of walk down the street and see a bunch of people lined up and say, hey, I wonder what they're doing. And then you just decide to start running with them whenever they're running, and then you end up winning. It doesn't work that way, right? There's a great deal of preparation and thought and sacrifice that goes into winning a marathon and establishing a great house. And Abram was given a vision by God. It was costly. I noted that before. It entailed leaving what he had known to go someplace he didn't know. And he had room in that vision for other people to join in. He brought along, obviously, all the people that he had acquired in Haran, but also his nephew Lot, his wife, of course. But at the center of the vision was the family. And I think that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. At the center of the vision was the family, the household. Now, if a great house is to be established, you need to have worthy heirs. And so a major part of the development of a great house is developing, the people who will take the vision and carry it on into the future after you're gone. So you need to have a development plan, so to speak. So what is the development plan? I think one of the reasons why we're not raising the kind of children that we can depend upon is because we're not raising the kind of children we can depend upon. In other words, we don't expect much. But I think if we expect more of our kids, I think we'll be surprised that they'll rise to the occasion. So we need to expect more of our kids. We're told that the Lord himself was perfected through suffering in Hebrews, right? He was perfected through suffering. He wasn't perfected because he was sent to the best school or because he had the best of everything or any of that kind of stuff. Suffering was integral to his development and his perfection. Perfection being understood here as maturation, getting to the place where he needed to be in order to do his work. And I think that we tend to raise our children in sheltered environments, and as a result, they're weak and undeveloped when they arrive at the point where they should be strong and ready to work. So how do we change that? Well, I think that, again, we can go back to the great houses of the past and look at them and see if we can and learn some things. And, if you think about, say, Alexander the Great. Now, there's a guy. He really carried the family vision forward. He took it up a notch, right? So his father, it's true that he hired a great tutor. It was Aristotle. You think about this, you think about the connection between Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great. Man, there's a chain of influence there, right? But his childhood was one in which he was continually being challenged and trained so as to become a warrior king and extend the family's influence. And getting back to Dune, the film. Maybe some of you have seen it. If you haven't, the book is something that you should read. But in that film, you have this great house, the Atreides house, and Paul Atreides, who's like the protagonist of the story. His childhood is nothing but preparation. It's nothing but preparation for the great task of replacing his father. And that's the kind of mindset we should have. We should be working, if you read the book or see the film, you see that at any given time, his tutors could, attack him. With the idea that, because he is an Atreides, there are people out there who would attack him in a moment of, vulnerability with the express intent of actually killing him. So in order to prepare him for a life in which he's continuously under threat, he has to be subjected to a lot of threats, right? You need to get out there and do stuff. I think what that implies is that virtue is the goal, not happiness. Virtue is the goal, not happiness. Now, I know that some of you might be familiar with Aristotle and his thoughts on on happiness. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the Oprah Winfrey School of Happiness. Okay? The Oprah Winfrey School of Happiness is, kind of, if it feels good, do it. If that's who you are, we should all love you and accept you and that kind of thing. Let's think a little bit about the word virtue. The root, vir, means man. And so there's a sense in which manliness is what was the kind of in view when it came to virtue. And when you think about, say, Homeric, the Homeric epics, what you have there is often Homer extolling the virtues of the various characters in the stories. So these long descriptions of things like the brightness of the shield and all this kind of stuff kind of is meant to bring this out. Back in antiquity, when people would talk about the virtues, what they were talking about is what makes a manly man. What they had in mind was a warrior. And so they would make lists of things that would characterize a great warrior. And so things get included in those lists that you might not associate with virtue today in the way we think about virtue, but it makes sense if the goal is to be a great warrior. So something like, obviously, bravery is a great virtue, but also cunning. Cunning. Odysseus is an example of that, right? He is the guy that cooks up the idea for the Trojan horse. Cunning, right? So he's a very great warrior because he uses his noggin. And that's the sort of thing that's in view when we think about arete, excellence, and consequently there's a kind of a task orientation when it comes to virtue development. It's not just something kind of a state of being where you're just a really great guy. You actually do stuff. You do stuff. That's how you demonstrate your virtues, by doing stuff. It's a goal-oriented thing. And the goal, when we think in these terms, is self-mastery and an ability to employ a range of strengths and gifts to achieve, success. So this kind of thinking, I think, is very important if we're going to have worthy heirs. We shouldn't measure our work as parents based on whether or not the child is necessarily content or happy or at any given moment. When my kids were small, I would explain to them, I talked all the time, but I basically told them I wanted them to be weird. My gift to you is weirdness. What do I mean by that? I didn't want them to just kind of fit in. I wanted them to stand out. I wanted them to develop their gifts. I wanted them to excel. Now, each of the children has his or her own sort of, I guess, muse, you could say. There's something that characterizes that particular child, and I would try to encourage that child in that set of things that were of interest to him. So, like an example, my oldest son, he was the athlete. He was also the musician. It's a weird combination. But he, when he was a little guy, like 4 years old, he wanted to switch hit. So we played, ball all the time. His first word was ball. It wasn't mom, wasn't dad, it was ball. So we kind of went with that. And he ended up playing for the town team, went on to play high school basketball and stuff. And now he records music in Nashville, figure. Anyway, my second son had zero interest in sports. I remember, when my oldest was young, he was just all into baseball and just couldn't wait to get out there and play. And the teams he played on were always good. And my second son, we'd put him out in left field or right field, and he just kind of like daydream. Look at the sky, the ball would be hit out to him. He'd notice it go by, and then that kind of thing. I said, this boy has got a whole different thing going. But he was the guy that became the builder, and so I worked in construction for a while, and I was told by guys that I worked for that I didn't move efficiently. I wasn't an efficient mover. So efficiency, in the building trade is really important. Got to work fast. But anyway, I noticed that my second son, he had kind of an ability when it came to working with his hands. So my oldest son was the macro-coordinated guy. My second son was the micro-coordinated guy. And he would be able to make things. He'd just make things. And early on, I told my wife it's time to get him a pocket knife. And her objection was, he's only 7. He'll cut himself. I'd say, of course, that's how he'll learn it sharp. Cut himself. And he did, man. He was just like, he's got scars to this day. But anyway, I really kind of saw that he just kind of had a knack for that kind of stuff. And one of the things I did was I would give him tasks, and I would notice that he would stop, think about it, and then perform the task a lot faster than I thought he would get it done. I said, this kid's got it. So that meant you kind of go with that. But with both boys, I was really working hard to get them to think in these terms about excellence, virtue, achievement, and these kinds of things. And I wanted them to know that failure is an option. So we live in a world with helicopter parents. When I was a kid, we didn't have helicopter parents. Sometimes my parents didn't know where I was for days. I'm exaggerating just slightly. Then we even have like lawnmower parents. Have you heard of lawnmower parents? They're the parents who go before the child and remove every obstacle. So the child never learns to like overcome things because everything has already been addressed and everything's just flat and smooth and effortless. We just kind of go through life that way. Have you seen that the people are now like in their 20s bringing their parents along with them to like job interviews? This is like a real thing, It's just weird. And anyway, so we need to reverse all this. We need to reverse all this because the goal, this is the goal. You want a kid who can live without you. Let that sink in. You want your kid to be able to live well without you because you will die. Hopefully before the kid does, right? So the goal is to get that kid in a place where they're ready for that day. And the earlier they're ready for that day, the better. What you want to do is really keep that in mind. And you know what I've noticed with kids? Is they rise to the occasion. We underestimate our kids. We challenge them. We say, you can do it. It's been done before. It's not like you're the first human being that ever lived. You can do it. And we challenge them, and we have expectations that they will rise to the occasion. It happens. So anyway, now it's not a fail-safe thing. You still end up with a rotten kid. Think about, Marcus Aurelius. Consider one of the great 5 emperors. I've read his book. Good book, by the way. Apparently the kid didn't read it. Commodus. That's why we call a commode. It's named for that guy. I didn't make that up. It's named for that guy. So even Marcus Aurelius can mess it up. But often it turns out great if you have the right thing in view. And someday I intend to, hand things on. And I hope that the things that I hand on to my kids will be a blessing to them and they'll be able to manage them well and then hand them on again. And then again, and then again. And that's the idea. And if things are really successful, phenomenally successful, let's say I die, and after I'm dead, I'm like a huge success as a literary person, and I have this huge estate that balloons, well, I hope they can manage it. That's all tongue-in-cheek, by the way, but I kind of hope it does work out that way. It's actually the way it worked out pretty much for C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. Those guys were kind of living hand-to-mouth most of their lives. It was only very late in life that they acquired the kind of literary success and wealth that we now associate with their estates. Anyway, so that's enough of that. I'm happy to answer a few questions before we have to run to the airport. But anything? Yeah.
What sorts of things do you recommend to do with or to say to my young children now in order to help grow that vision for being part of multi-generational wealth or dynastic thinking? How do I do that with young kids right
Yeah. Well, I think it's not always easy to do, particularly in an economy like ours that's so, sort of digital character. But if as much as you can, bring them into the work. I think that's really important. And as they're working with you, you're telling them why it's important. And I think actually kids want to contribute. And if we give them meaningful things to do to help with the work, that's a place to start when they're small. So we did a lot of that, we did a lot of stuff that we didn't have to do because it was good stuff to do because kids could help, right? But at the same time, it was materially beneficial. It wasn't just like make work. I think a lot of the stuff that we tend to tell our kids to do, require them to do, does kind of feel like make work. Like chores and stuff like that sometimes can feel like make work. Like, I remember when we were talking to my second son, who was just an absolute slob, that he needed to make his bed, and he was like, "Why? I don't mind a messy room." He's like, "Your mom does." But it still felt like make work. But he was, very productive in many ways with regard to helping with the stuff that we did, particularly when it came to the properties. Yeah.
Do you think that allowances teach kids about how to handle money at all, or
Yeah, we didn't use them in my household. I'm not like against them in principle or something like that, but we just didn't do it. Um, I received an allowance as a kid, and I completely blew it on candy every time. It's kind of my experience of it. But maybe there are other kids that are different than me. I'm sure there are. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
In a family or a generation that's coming up thinking about starting the next leg of the dynasty, but also prematurely taking care of the previous leg of the dynasty, how would you think about setting up priorities and where to allocate time and resources?
Wow. It's a great question. I think I'd have to know a little more about the detail, and I'm not asking you to share that, but I think a lot of it has to do with your obligations to the previous generation, but then making certain that you've got the energy for the generation that follows. So, the classic story is the Aeneid, where you've got this picture of Aeneas who fulfills his responsibilities in terms of caring for his family, thinking about his parent or his father, and then thinking about his son and the world that he's helping to establish for him. That's all kind of wrapped up in that particular story. So it's a great story. I'm amazed that it's never been made into a film, or at least I'm not aware of a film. It would be, I think, a great one to produce. But I think that, in my mind, is kind of the image that you kind of work with. You have to kind of think in both directions. Ideally, of course, your parents ought to be supportive of your work for the generation that follow, right? It shouldn't be like a competition necessarily. It should be, they want to help out with that. But anyway, yeah.
As we get into a digital AI age, what skills and abilities would you like to see families in your church and our churches learning and implementing and passing on to their children that would be easy to lose?
Yeah, so in the book I'm working on, I've got a chapter entitled Apple Pie and Rocket Ships. And kind of the vision of the future I think we need, at least I'm trying to promote, is one in which things are still human, that's apple pie, and then we do take advantage of the best features of the new tech, because there are some really marvelous things that, if we limit ourselves to artificial intelligence, it can do that no human being can do. So, I think that particularly when it comes to childhood, we should try to keep the childhood as analog as possible and introduce our children to the tools, the digital tools, very carefully and thoughtfully. I think that there needs to be kind of a process that we work through on that. Because I think that what can happen, and I've seen it happen, is like if you are just like, we don't have any digital technology in our home, and then suddenly the kid is an adult, you just can get like completely absorbed, like overnight, becoming an addict to the smartphone and stuff. I've seen it. So we need to have a plan for how do we, work our kids into that, because it's not going away. It's only going to become more and more intrusive. I think robotics is huge. I think we'll have a lot more interaction with robots than we maybe anticipate. It's interesting to me that, back in the 60s, families lived in the future. But now, like when you see science fiction, it's like they don't exist. I don't know if you've noticed that. Remember Lost in Space? Like one of the campiest shows in the history of television, right? mom, dad, kids, the stowaway crazy doctor, and then the robot and all that kind of stuff. And it was kind of like Gilligan's Island. They're stranded on a desert planet, a deserted planet instead of like a deserted island. But or the Jetsons. When was the last time you actually saw something like that? Now it's all really creepy alien kind of Philip K. Dick weird stuff. Anyway, but I think we need a vision for it. I think we need to imagine what could it be like and work toward that. So I think it'll mean putting some limits on things. So, yeah. Yep. Yeah. Oh, I think it's a huge benefit. Yeah, if you can make it work. So I get to fly to my Connecticut house like every other month. And this is one of the pluses of like the tech is that we're able to maintain a lot of interaction with each other. So, but it's better to be in a physical space with each other. And I do intend to go back to Connecticut when I'm done with my work in Washington. And they know that because need to be close to the grandkids and the kids. But there's a lot to be said for being near each other. I'm sorry, but I've just been told I was the last question.